A city sleeps under a quiet moon, unaware that dawn will bring a cataclysm. History often turns not on grand plans, but on a single, unexpected spark. We are about to journey through 30 of these decisive moments, where one event sent our world spiraling down a completely different path. You will discover the astonishing accidents, the fateful decisions, and the chance encounters that truly shaped everything we know today. What tiny twist of fate doomed an empire, or what forgotten discovery launched a revolution? What single day out of millions do you think altered our story the most? A wrong turn on a sunny morning in Sarajevo would echo for a century. It was June 28, 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was visiting this turbulent city on a day steeped in nationalistic passion. The air was thick with tension. Just hours earlier, a bomb had been thrown at the Archduke's motorcade, an attack he miraculously survived. The city was a tinderbox, and the Archduke's visit was the spark. After the failed bombing, the decision was made to cancel the rest of the public appearances and take a different route to the hospital to check on an officer injured in the blast. But the driver was not told of the change. Confused, he made a fateful error, turning onto a narrow street called Franz Joseph Street and stalling the car as he tried to reverse. It was a moment of pure, agonizing chance. Standing on that very corner, having given up hope after the morning's failure, was a young Bosnian Serb nationalist named Gavrilo Princip. He could not believe his luck. He stepped forward, raised his pistol, and fired 2 shots. The Archduke and his wife, Sophie, were killed. This single act of violence did not just claim 2 lives. It was the key that unlocked a continent-wide conflict. A complex web of alliances, like a row of dominoes, began to fall. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized to defend Serbia. Germany, honoring its alliance, declared war on Russia, and then France. The invasion of Belgium drew Britain into the fray. Within weeks, the entire world was at war. The Great War, as it was known, would claim millions of lives, shatter empires, and redraw the map of the world. All of it can be traced back to that one stalled car, on that one street, on that one day. One wrong turn, one moment of hesitation, and the 20th century was forever changed. Just 3 decades later, another chance discovery in the dust would unlock a door to a past just as world-changing, but infinitely more ancient. In the summer of 1799, French soldiers were reinforcing a crumbling fort in the Egyptian town of Rosetta. A young officer named Pierre-François Bouchard was supervising the work when his men unearthed a large, dark slab of granodiorite, a stone similar to granite. It was covered in writing, but not just one kind. The stone presented a puzzle in 3 distinct scripts. At the top were the elegant pictorial symbols of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. Below that was a cursive script we now call Demotic, the everyday writing of the Egyptians, and at the bottom was ancient Greek, a language scholars already understood. This was the Rosetta Stone. The realization was electrifying. The Greek text, a decree from the priests of Memphis honoring Pharaoh Ptolemy V, was the key. Scholars immediately understood that the 3 inscriptions likely said the same thing. For the first time, they had a translation manual, a way to crack a code that had been silent for over 1,000 years. The race was on. For more than 2 decades, brilliant minds wrestled with the stone's mystery. The final breakthrough came from a French linguist named Jean-François Champollion. He focused on the cartouches, the oval loops that enclosed royal names. Using the known Greek name Ptolemy as a starting point, he matched the hieroglyphic signs to sounds. He then applied this knowledge to another cartouche, one for the famous Cleopatra, and the symbols aligned. Champollion had proven that hieroglyphs were not just mystical pictures, but a complex system that also represented sounds. It was the key turning the lock. With that single stone, the entire civilization of ancient Egypt was suddenly thrown open. Temples and tombs, once mute, began to speak. We could now read the words of the pharaohs, understand their religious beliefs, and follow their historical records. Egyptology was transformed from mere speculation into a true science, all because a soldier's shovel struck a rock one ordinary day. That one slab of stone rewrote our understanding of human history itself. A ship drifting into the port of Messina in October 1347 was a herald of the end. The Genoese sailors on board were already dying, their bodies covered in dark, painful swellings. They had brought the Black Death from the trading posts of the Black Sea, and with their arrival, the plague took its first irrevocable step onto European soil. The horror that followed was unprecedented. The disease spread with terrifying speed, carried by fleas on rats that scurried down the very ropes tying these ships to the docks. Within days, the Sicilian port city was a graveyard. People would feel fine in the morning, develop a fever by noon, and be dead by nightfall. It was a biological firestorm that no one could comprehend or contain. By the time it finally burned itself out a few years later, this single biological event had wiped out roughly 1 in every 3 people across the entire continent. The sheer scale of the death was unimaginable, but the aftermath was even more transformative. The feudal system, built on a vast pool of cheap peasant labor, suddenly crumbled. With so many workers dead, those who survived found their labor was suddenly valuable. They could demand higher wages and better conditions, upending centuries of rigid social hierarchy. The authority of the church was also shattered. Prayers and penance had done nothing to stop the pestilence, and this crisis of faith fueled doubt and new ways of thinking. Out of the ashes of this colossal tragedy, the old world was broken apart. The resulting labor shortages, social mobility, and intellectual questioning created a vacuum, a space where new ideas could finally take root. It was from this fertile, tragic ground that the Renaissance would eventually grow, a rebirth funded and fueled by the death of a third of Europe. One ship, one cargo of pestilence, and the entire trajectory of Western civilization was permanently altered. For centuries, the massive Theodosian walls had been the ultimate shield, repelling every army that dared challenge the great city of Constantinople. But in the spring of 1453, they faced a new kind of weapon, one that could shatter stone itself. The young Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, had brought monstrous cannons, the largest the world had ever seen. For weeks, his gunners pounded a single section of the legendary walls, day and night, until the ancient fortifications began to crumble. On May 29th, the final assault came. The last Roman emperor, Constantine XI, knew the end had arrived. He was last seen throwing off his imperial regalia, drawing his sword, and charging into the oncoming tide of Ottoman soldiers, disappearing into history. His death marked not just the fall of a city, but the final, absolute end of the Roman Empire, a political entity that had endured for nearly 2,000 years. The immediate shock was immense, but the ripple effects would reshape the entire globe. With Constantinople, now Istanbul, under Ottoman control, the lucrative land routes to the spice-rich East were suddenly severed, or at least made prohibitively expensive for European merchants. The world, for Europe, had just become a much larger, more isolated place. This single military conquest created an urgent, desperate need to find another way. It forced European kingdoms, particularly Spain and Portugal, to look outward, to gamble on a radical idea, sailing into the vast, unknown Atlantic in search of a sea route to the Indies. That desperate search, funded by the very fear and ambition the fall of Constantinople created, led directly to the voyages of explorers like Christopher Columbus. One city's fall closed a door to the east, but in doing so, it flung open a gateway to an entire new world, waiting to be found. Inside a small workshop in Mainz, a man named Johannes Gutenberg was quietly assembling a machine that would become an engine for revolution. His invention was the printing press with movable metal type, and its impact was so profound it is difficult to overstate. Before Gutenberg, books were copied entirely by hand, a slow and exorbitantly expensive process. A single Bible could take a scribe over a year to complete, making books rare treasures owned almost exclusively by the church and the very wealthy. Knowledge itself was a locked vault, and they held the only key. Gutenberg's press changed everything. For the first time, text could be set with individual, reusable metal letters, inked, and then pressed onto paper in a rapid mechanical process. His famous 42-line Bible, produced around 1455, proved the system worked. Suddenly, books were not just for the elite. They could be produced in the hundreds, then the thousands, at a fraction of the former cost. This single technological innovation shattered the old monopoly on information. Ideas could now spread faster than any army could march, and they found their first great explosion in the teachings of a German monk named Martin Luther. When Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in 1517, his arguments against church corruption did not just stay in that German town. They were printed, copied, and distributed across the continent in a matter of weeks, not years. The printing press gave the Reformation its voice and its audience, turning a theological debate into a continent-wide revolt that fractured Christendom forever. But the press power did not stop with religion. It fueled the scientific revolution, allowing astronomers like Copernicus and Galileo to share their radical findings widely and accurately, building upon each other's work. It created a new class of literate citizens who could read, think, and debate matters of law and governance for themselves. The very concept of public opinion was born in the ink of Gutenberg's press, laying the essential groundwork for modern democracy. One machine in one workshop unlocked the power of mass communication and set in motion the chain of events that would create our modern world. The power of the printed word could challenge kings, but that authority first had to be wrested from a monarch's absolute grasp. On a damp field beside the River Thames in June 1215, a group of angry barons faced their despised king, John. He had driven the kingdom to the brink of civil war with his cruel and arbitrary rule, his endless punishing taxes, and his disregard for the ancient customs that even a sovereign was expected to honor. The barons were not asking for a revolution. They were demanding that the king acknowledge a fundamental truth, that his power was not limitless. The document they forced him to put his seal to that day was the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. It was not a declaration of human rights as we might think of them today. It was a practical, feudal agreement meant to curb the abuses of a specific, terrible king. Yet buried within its Latin clauses were principles that would echo for 1,000 years. The most famous of these was Clause 39, which stated that no free man could be imprisoned, stripped of his possessions, or harmed in any way except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. This single sentence established the bedrock idea of due process of law. It declared that the king was not above the law but subject to it. The king's will alone was no longer enough to condemn a person. At the time, it was a temporary peace treaty that failed almost immediately, annulled by the Pope within weeks, but the idea it represented refused to die. It was reissued and reaffirmed over the following centuries, each time gaining more power as a symbol of liberty against tyranny. This single document, born from a political squabble in a muddy field, became the foundation for the entire English common law system. Its DNA is woven directly into the American Constitution and its Bill of Rights, guaranteeing the very same protections against arbitrary power. From that one tense confrontation came the seed of a concept so powerful it would one day shape nations, the principle that everyone, from the lowest citizen to the highest ruler, must answer to the law. The sky over Hiroshima was clear and blue on the morning of August 6, 1945. At 8:15 and 17 seconds, the bomb bay of the American B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, opened. A single 10-foot-long cylinder nicknamed Little Boy fell away, tumbling toward the city center nearly 6 miles below. For 43 seconds, it fell in near silence. Then, at an altitude of just under 2,000 feet, it detonated. The result was not an explosion as anyone had ever known it, but a new sun born on the surface of the Earth. A flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns bleached the landscape white. The temperature at the hypocenter, the point directly below the blast, reached several million degrees. The granite stones of buildings directly below vaporized instantly. People simply ceased to exist. Their shadows burned permanently onto the stone pathways where they stood. A thunderous shockwave followed, pulverizing nearly everything within a 1-mile radius into splinters and dust. Then came the firestorm, a tornado of flame that sucked the oxygen from the air. In a single moment, a single bomb, an entire city was erased. The immediate goal was to force a swift end to the Second World War, and it worked. Japan surrendered just days later after a second atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki. But the true impact of that blinding flash over Hiroshima stretched far beyond the end of a single war. It was a dividing line in human history, the moment we unlocked the power to annihilate our entire species. That single act of warfare ushered in the atomic age, a new and terrifying era defined by the shadow of mutual assured destruction. For the first time, rival nations now held the power to not just defeat each other, but to end civilization itself. This grim reality has dictated global geopolitics ever since, an unspoken backdrop to every major conflict. It created a fragile, perpetual peace held together only by the threat of total ruin, a world living under a sword of its own making, a sword we first forged on that quiet summer morning over Japan. The atomic flash over Japan represented a sudden, terrifying leap in human power, but another kind of explosion, one that unfolded over centuries, began with 3 small ships lost on an endless ocean. In August 1492, Christopher Columbus set sail from Spain under a simple, stubborn conviction that by sailing west he could reach the riches of the East. His 3 tiny vessels, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, were embarking on a journey into the literal unknown. For weeks they saw nothing but empty, rolling waves. The crews grew restless, then terrified. They were convinced they would sail right off the edge of the world or simply never find land, starving to death in a watery void. Mutiny simmered just below the deck planks. Columbus, desperately trying to maintain order, was reportedly keeping 2 separate logs, one with the true distance they had traveled, and a second, falsified one to show the crew a shorter, less frightening figure. The tension was at its breaking point when, on October 12th, a lookout on the Pinto finally screamed the words they had all but given up hope of hearing. Land. They had not reached the Spice Islands of Asia, as Columbus believed until his dying day. They had instead stumbled upon a small island in the Bahamas, a completely new world, entirely separate from the maps of Europe, Asia, and Africa. That single landfall, that first tentative step onto a Caribbean beach, was the event that connected 2 hemispheres for the first time since the last ice age. This connection sparked the Columbian Exchange, a biological and cultural transfer that utterly remade the planet. It was a swap of unprecedented scale. To the Americas, Europe sent horses, cattle, wheat, sugar, and coffee, along with the devastating specter of smallpox and measles, diseases to which Native Americans had no immunity. In return, the Americas gave the world potatoes, tomatoes, corn, and chocolate, crops that would go on to fuel population booms across Europe and Asia. Think of Italian cuisine without tomatoes or Ireland without the potato. This single voyage, born from a navigational era, created the world we live in today, a globally connected, interdependent network of people, plants, and economies. One man's failed quest for a shortcut created the very concept of a globalized world. A single fortress stood as the ultimate symbol of a king's unchecked power. The Bastille, with its 8 grim towers, was more than just a prison. It was a physical manifestation of the ancient regime, a place where the monarch could lock away anyone he pleased indefinitely and without trial. For the people of Paris, it represented everything they were starving to overthrow. The summer of 1789 was a cauldron of desperation. The price of bread had skyrocketed, and the air was thick with rumors that the king's soldiers were coming to crush the newly formed National Assembly. The people needed weapons, and they knew the Bastille held a store of gunpowder. On the morning of July 14th, a massive, furious crowd gathered outside its gates. What began as a demand for arms quickly exploded into a full-scale siege. The governor of the fortress, Bernard-René de Launay, initially tried to negotiate, but the situation spiraled out of control. A shot rang out, then another, and the crowd surged forward. They were not a professional army, but a chaotic swarm of artisans, shopkeepers, and laborers, armed with little more than pikes, axes, and a burning sense of injustice. They broke through the outer courtyards, and after a bloody firefight, the drawbridge was lowered. The fall of the Bastille was not a strategic military victory. It was a raw, visceral act of popular will. The mob seized the gunpowder, but more importantly, they captured the governor and several of his guards. As they paraded through the streets, the crowd's fury could not be contained. De Launay was dragged away and killed, his head mounted on a pike. This single, brutal day sent a shockwave across France and all of Europe. The king, Louis XVI, when told of the event, could only ask, "Is it a revolt?" The reply was legendary. "No, sire, it is a revolution." The storming of the Bastille was the point of no return. It proved that the people, when united, could topple the very pillars of tyranny. The event electrified the nation, igniting the French Revolution in earnest and sending its radical ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity flashing across the continent. Monarchs everywhere watched in horror, realizing their own thrones were suddenly less secure. But from the chaotic fervor of the revolution, a new kind of leader would eventually emerge, a young artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte, who would harness the nation's revolutionary energy and turn it into an empire, redrawing the map of Europe with his ambitions. The fall of those old stone walls did not just free a handful of prisoners, it unleashed forces that would dominate the next century. A messy laboratory can be a cradle for miracles. In September 1928, a Scottish bacteriologist named Alexander Fleming returned to his cramped London lab after a summer vacation. His workspace was famously cluttered with stacks of Petri dishes, many of them still coated with cultures of Staphylococcus bacteria. One dish in particular had been left uncovered, and a mold spore drifting in from an open window had landed and begun to grow. Most scientists would have seen a contaminated experiment, a failure to be tossed into the disinfectant tray. But Fleming noticed something extraordinary. All around the patch of blue-green mold, the colonies of bacteria were not just receding, they were dying, as if the mold had secreted a substance that was lethal to them. He famously remarked, "That's funny." This single, curious observation was the birth of penicillin. Fleming had discovered the world's first true antibiotic, but its potential was not immediately realized. Isolating and producing the miracle mold in useful quantities was a monumental challenge that would take over a decade and a world war to solve. It was not until the 1940s that a team at Oxford University, led by Howard Florey and Ernst Chain, finally unlocked a way to mass-produce the drug. When it reached the battlefields of the Second World War, its impact was nothing short of magical. Soldiers who would have previously died from infected wounds or diseases like pneumonia were suddenly walking away cured. A simple scratch or a strep throat, which for all of human history had been a potential death sentence, was now routinely treatable with a course of injections. This single accidental discovery in a messy lab ushered in the age of antibiotics, single-handedly creating modern medicine as we know it. It transformed surgery, making complex procedures safe from the threat of post-operative infection. It fundamentally extended the average human life expectancy by decades. That one Petri dish, which so easily could have been washed away, set off a biological revolution that has saved countless hundreds of millions of lives, proving that sometimes the greatest discoveries are not sought but simply noticed. Even the most powerful man in Rome was not safe from the whispers of his friends. Julius Caesar had been declared dictator for life, a title that sounded the death knell for the ancient republic. On the Ides of March, 44 years before the Common Era, a group of senators who called themselves the Liberators believed they had a sacred duty. They convinced themselves that only one man stood between Rome and tyranny, and that removing him would restore the old republic. The plan was set for a meeting of the Senate, held not in its usual chamber but in the grand portico of the theater of Pompey. As Caesar took his seat, the conspirators gathered around him under the pretense of presenting a petition. One of them, Tullius Cimber, grabbed his toga, pulling it down from his shoulders. This was the signal. The first dagger struck. Caesar, shocked, tried to rise, but then he saw a face he knew and trusted, Marcus Brutus, stepping forward with his own blade drawn. The ancient sources claim Caesar's last words were not the dramatic Latin phrase we often hear, but a pained Greek utterance, "You too, my child." The assassins struck not once or twice, but 23 times, each blow a desperate, violent attempt to kill not just a man, but an idea. They believed the death of a dictator would be a glorious act of liberation. They were catastrophically wrong. Instead of cheering their heroism, the people of Rome met the news with horror and rage. The murder did not restore the Republic. It shattered the last fragile pretense of its existence. Caesar's death created a power vacuum so vast it plunged the entire Roman world into a final, brutal civil war. On one side were the assassins, the so-called liberators. On the other was a powerful new alliance, the Second Triumvirate, led by Caesar's loyal lieutenant, Mark Antony, and his young adopted heir, a cunning 18-year-old named Octavian. The war that followed was a fight for the very soul of Rome, and it ended with Octavian's total victory. He took a new name, Augustus, and became the first true emperor. The single act of stabbing a man in a theater portico did not save the Republic. It guaranteed its absolute and final destruction, replacing 5 centuries of senatorial rule with an imperial system that would last for another 500 years. One murder, intended to preserve an old world, instead built a new one from the ground up. A new kind of signal pierced the global airwaves on October 4, 1957. It was a simple, relentless beep, beep, beep broadcast from a small, polished sphere no larger than a beach ball, racing through the sky at 18,000 miles per hour. The world listened, and for many, the sound was not one of scientific triumph, but of profound shock. The Soviet Union had launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, and it was circling the Earth. Overnight, the sky was no longer just the domain of gods and birds, but a new frontier for human technology and, chillingly, for warfare. If the Soviets could put a satellite in orbit, they could also launch a nuclear warhead that could strike anywhere on the planet with virtually no warning. The psychological impact, particularly in the United States, was seismic. It felt as if the very fabric of national security had been torn open. This singular beeping orb triggered a panic that would be channeled into an unprecedented national effort. The space race had begun, and the finish line was nothing less than the stars themselves. In response, the United States poured billions of dollars into science and technology, creating the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, and passing the National Defense Education Act to train a new generation of engineers and mathematicians. The goal was no longer just to catch up, but to surpass the Soviet achievement, culminating in President John F. Kennedy's bold promise to land a man on the moon. That single beeping satellite, a simple ball of metal, did not just start a competition. It fundamentally reoriented humanity's place in the universe, transforming us from earthbound observers into a spacefaring species and launching a technological revolution whose echoes we still feel in every smartphone and GPS device today. The violent death of a dictator shattered the old world, but sometimes a slapstick survival can be just as catastrophic. High in the halls of Prague Castle on a spring day in 1618, a meeting of Protestant nobles reached its boiling point. They were enraged by the new Catholic king's decision to shut down their churches, a direct violation of their religious rights. As their fury mounted, they seized the two royal Catholic governors and their secretary, put them on trial right there in the chamber, and found them guilty of suppressing the Protestant faith. The sentence was uniquely brutal and uniquely bohemian. They dragged the three men to an open window 70 feet above the rocky ground below and threw them out. It was an act of political murder known as defenestration, but then something absurd happened. All three men survived the fall. According to legend, they landed in a soft, deep pile of manure, a dung heap that had conveniently been placed directly below. The Catholic version claimed they were saved by the merciful intervention of angels. The Protestants insisted it was just the sheer power of the filth that cushioned their fall. This single, almost comical act of violence was the spark that lit a continent. The Holy Roman Emperor, a fervent Catholic, could not let such an insult to his authority stand. He raised an army to crush the rebellious Bohemian Protestants, but the conflict did not stay contained. Fear of rising Catholic power pulled in nation after nation. Lutheran Denmark and Sweden saw a chance to curb Habsburg influence. Catholic France, paradoxically, joined the Protestant side, not for faith, but to weaken its rival, the Habsburg monarchy. What began with three men tossed from a window exploded into the 30 Years' War, a sprawling, nightmarish conflict that would become one of the most destructive in European history. Entire regions were depopulated by relentless warfare, famine, and disease. The map of Central Europe was permanently scarred and redrawn, and from the ashes of this 3-decade-long catastrophe emerged a new principle that would define the modern world, the Peace of Westphalia. This treaty established the concept of state sovereignty, the idea that each nation had the right to govern its own internal affairs, free from outside interference, including its choice of religion. The very foundation of our modern international system of nation-states was born from the fallout of that one strange and stinky political protest. A single spark in a baker's oven would transform a city forever. In the early hours of September 2, 1666, a small fire began in the King's Bakery on Pudding Lane. The summer had been long and dry, and London was a tinderbox of wooden houses packed tightly along narrow, winding medieval streets. A strong easterly wind quickly seized the flames, turning the initial blaze into an unstoppable firestorm. For 4 terrifying days, the inferno raged, consuming everything in its path. The diarist Samuel Pepys described the scene as an arch of fire across the city, a mile long, with people forced to flee by boat on the Thames, their worldly possessions piled into small boats as the sky behind them glowed a hellish orange. When the flames finally died out, the devastation was absolute. Over 13,000 houses, 87 parish churches, and the great St. Paul's Cathedral lay in smoldering ruins. An area larger than modern Paris had been utterly erased, yet from this total destruction came an unprecedented opportunity. The old, diseased, and cramped medieval city was gone. In its place, a new vision for urban life could be built. The task fell to a brilliant young architect and scientist, Christopher Wren. His new plan for London was a masterpiece of modern thinking, featuring wide, straight boulevards to prevent future fires from spreading so easily, and public buildings constructed from brick and stone instead of wood. Though not all of his grand plan was implemented, the spirit of it was. The new London that rose from the ashes was fundamentally different, a city of brick and order. This single catastrophe also sparked practical innovations that would ripple across the globe. To manage the immense cost of rebuilding, the first true fire insurance companies were born, allowing people to pool risk and recover from disaster. Firefighting, once a chaotic effort of bucket brigades, was professionalized with the creation of paid fire brigades, funded by these new insurance firms. The Great Fire of London was a tragedy of immense scale, but it forced a reckoning with urban design, creating a safer, more resilient city and setting a new standard for the entire world. One small fire on a single street proved that sometimes, from utter devastation, a better future must be forged. A quiet Sunday morning in paradise was shattered by the roar of approaching engines. On December 7, 1941, the first wave of Japanese warplanes descended on the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor with the specific, devastating intent of crippling the American Pacific Fleet. Sailors who moments before were enjoying breakfast or writing letters home suddenly found themselves racing to battle stations amid exploding bombs and the rattle of machine gun fire. The battleship USS Arizona took a direct hit to its ammunition magazine, erupting in a colossal fireball that tore the massive ship in half, sending over 1,000 men to their graves in an instant. In just under 2 hours, the surprise attack was over, leaving a scene of unimaginable destruction. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged, nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed, and more than 2,400 Americans were dead. The shockwave from those bombs did not just ripple across the water, it reverberated directly into the heart of every American citizen. For years, the United States had clung to a policy of isolationism, a determined desire to stay out of the conflicts engulfing Europe and Asia. The attack on Pearl Harbor, a place most Americans had never seen, instantly vaporized that illusion. The very next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress, his voice ringing with resolve as he labeled December 7th a date which will live in infamy. The declaration of war against Japan was nearly unanimous. With that single, brutal strike, Japan had accomplished what years of diplomatic pressure and distant warfare could not. It had unified a divided nation and thrust it fully into the Second World War. The sleeping giant, as the Japanese admiral who planned the attack would later call it, had been awoken, and its industrial and military might would now be brought to bear with overwhelming force. This sudden entry did more than just turn the tide of the war, it fundamentally reshaped the global order. The United States emerged from the conflict not just victorious, but as the preeminent economic and military power on Earth, its homeland untouched by the physical devastation that had crippled Europe and Asia. This new position of leadership forced America to abandon isolationism forever, actively creating and leading a new network of international alliances and institutions. The stage was now set for a new kind of struggle, not against empires but against ideologies, a protracted Cold War that would define the rest of the 20th century. One surprise attack on a peaceful harbor did not just start a war, it launched the American century. A single hammer striking a church door can make more noise than a cannon. On October 31, 1517, a young Augustinian monk named Martin Luther strode up to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. He carried a document, a list of 95 points of debate he wished to raise about the rampant corruption within the Catholic Church. Nailing such a challenge to the church door was not an act of rebellion in itself. It was the standard, academic way to announce a public disputation, much like pinning a notice to a university bulletin board today. Luther was likely expecting a scholarly discussion among theologians, but the tinder was dry and his hammer blow created a spark that would set all of Europe ablaze. His arguments were direct and explosive. He attacked the sale of indulgences, which were essentially certificates sold by the church promising to reduce a soul's time in purgatory. This practice, led by salesmen like the infamous Johann Tetzel, made it seem as though God's forgiveness could be purchased like a market commodity. Luther insisted that salvation was a matter of faith and divine grace, not a financial transaction. The true power of this act, however, lay not in the nail but in the press. The new technology of movable type seized upon Luther's theses and reproduced them with incredible speed. Within weeks, his arguments were being printed, translated from Latin into German, and distributed across the continent. The church could no longer contain the debate within the walls of a seminary. It was now raging in the public squares and taverns of every town. What began as a theological critique exploded into the Protestant Reformation, a movement that shattered the religious monopoly the Catholic Church had held over Western Europe for a millennium. Suddenly, there was an alternative. New denominations like Lutheranism and Calvinism emerged, challenging the Pope's authority and putting the Bible directly into the hands of the common people through translations in their own languages. This fracture was not peaceful. It plunged Europe into over a century of devastating religious wars as kings and princes chose sides, often for political gain as much as for faith. The very map of Europe was redrawn by faith, with the north largely turning Protestant and the south remaining Catholic. The cultural and political landscape was forever altered, establishing the principle of religious pluralism and setting the stage for the modern world where individual conscience could challenge institutional power. One man, one hammer, one document, and the entire spiritual unity of a continent was broken apart. The night was cold and the harbor dark, a perfect shroud for an act of treason. On December 16, 1773, a group of men, their faces smudged with soot and adorned with makeshift Mohawk disguises, moved silently through the streets of Boston. They were not professional soldiers, but merchants, artisans, and tradesmen, ordinary colonists pushed to an extraordinary brink. Their target was 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Elena, and the Beaver, all laden with a fortune in British tea. For hours, they worked with disciplined efficiency, hauling hundreds of heavy chests onto the decks, splitting them open with hatchets, and dumping their contents into the black water. The harbor was soon fouled with a sprawling, bitter brew. This was not mere vandalism. It was a meticulously staged political protest. The tea itself was the symbol of a deeply resented principle. The British Parliament had granted the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies, and though this actually made the tea cheaper, it came with a tiny tax still attached. For the colonists, the price was not the point. The issue was taxation without representation. By paying even a single penny of that tax, they would be acknowledging Parliament's right to tax them at all, a right they fiercely denied. Throwing the tea overboard was the most dramatic way to say no. The response from London was swift and severe. Outraged by this destruction of private property, Parliament passed a series of laws the colonists called the Intolerable Act. These punitive measures closed the port of Boston, revoked Massachusetts' charter, and allowed British officials to be tried in England for crimes committed in the colonies. The intended effect was to isolate and punish Massachusetts, to make an example of it. Instead, it had the opposite result. The other colonies saw the punishment of Boston as a threat to them all. They sent food and supplies to the blockaded city, and more importantly, they sent delegates to the First Continental Congress. That single night of destruction in Boston Harbor had forged a shared sense of grievance and purpose. It transformed a protest over tea into a unified stand for liberty, setting the colonies irrevocably on the path to revolution. One act of defiance, one harbor full of floating tea leaves, and the course of a new nation was steered toward independence. The mountain had been rumbling for days, a distant grumble most citizens chose to ignore. But on August 24th, in the year 79, Mount Vesuvius tore itself apart. The eruption was not a river of lava, but something far more terrifying. The volcano shot a column of superheated gas, ash, and rock over 10 miles into the sky, blotting out the sun. Then the mountain began to rain down pumice stone, a relentless, crushing hail of porous rock that piled up feet high with every passing hour, collapsing roofs and trapping people inside their homes. This was only the beginning. As the volcanic column collapsed under its own weight, it sent pyroclastic surges, waves of scorching gas and pulverized rock, racing down the slopes at hurricane speeds. These surges, hotter than a pizza oven and utterly suffocating, instantly killed every living thing in their path, including the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum. In a single day, 2 thriving Roman towns were not just destroyed, they were entombed, frozen in a deadly grey shroud. The tragedy was absolute, a horrifying natural disaster that erased thousands of lives. Yet this same act of destruction created one of history's most profound paradoxes. The very ash and volcanic material that suffocated Pompeii and Herculaneum acted as a perfect preservative, sealing them away from air, moisture, and the decay of time. When archaeologists began their systematic excavations centuries later, they were not just digging up ruins, they were opening a time capsule. They found a world suspended in its final moments. A loaf of bread still sitting in an oven, jars of wine and olive oil in a shop, a poignant message scrawled on a wall, and most hauntingly, the hollow spaces in the hardened ash where bodies had once lain, spaces that archaeologists could fill with plaster to create casts of the victims in their final, desperate poses. This single cataclysm gave us an unparalleled, almost cinematic window into the daily life of ordinary Romans. We don't just know how their emperors lived from grand monuments, we know how the baker, the banker, and the street vendor lived. We can walk their streets, see their vibrant frescoes, and read their graffiti. The eruption of Vesuvius was a human tragedy of immense scale, but it provided the raw, intimate evidence that has fundamentally shaped and utterly humanized our entire understanding of the ancient world. 2 armies stood facing each other on Senlac Hill, the fate of a kingdom resting on the day's outcome. King Harold Godwinson and his Anglo-Saxon housecarls, weary from a forced march south after defeating a Viking army in the north, now faced a new invader. William, Duke of Normandy, had landed on the English coast, claiming a promise made to him that the English crown was rightfully his. The Anglo-Saxons formed a formidable shield wall, a bristling line of interlocked shields and spears that had proven nearly unbreakable in their previous battle. William's Norman knights, a mix of cavalry and archers, launched assault after assault up the slope, but the wall held firm. Then the Normans employed a cunning and desperate tactic. A section of their army turned and fled, appearing to break in panic and retreat. It was a feint, a deliberate trick. Seeing their enemy run, parts of the Anglo-Saxon line, likely the less disciplined local militia, broke formation in a hot-blooded charge to pursue them. It was the fatal mistake William had hoped for. As the English scattered down the hill, the Norman cavalry wheeled around and cut them to pieces. The shield wall was shattered. The battle descended into a chaotic slaughter around the English standards. It was in this melee that history turned on the flight of a single arrow. King Harold, fighting desperately with his men, was struck in the eye by a Norman arrow, according to the most famous account. The king fell, and with him fell Anglo-Saxon England. The battle was over. William's victory was total. He was crowned King of England on Christmas Day, an event that would be known forever as the Norman Conquest. This was not merely a change of ruler, it was a wholesale transformation of English society. The old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was swept away, replaced by a French-speaking Norman elite. The English language was flooded with thousands of new words, forever blending its Germanic roots with Latin-based French, creating the rich hybrid tongue we speak today. The legal system was overhauled, introducing Norman concepts of feudalism and central justice that laid the groundwork for English common law. Castles, unknown in England before, began to dot the landscape, symbols of a new foreign power. England was torn from its Scandinavian orbit and violently yanked into the sphere of continental Europe, a relationship that would define its politics, its wars, and its culture for the next 1,000 years. All of it, the entire future of the English-speaking world, pivoted on one stray arrow on an October afternoon. A quiet publication in a London bookshop sent a tremor through the very foundations of human thought. On November 24, 1859, Charles Darwin released On the Origin of Species, and its first print run of 1,250 copies sold out in a single day. The book was not a light read, but its central argument was explosive. Darwin proposed that the immense diversity of life on Earth was not the result of separate divine creations, but of a single, gradual, and relentless process he called natural selection. Life, in his view, was a constant struggle for existence, where individuals with slight, random variations that gave them an advantage were more likely to survive and pass those traits to their offspring. Over millions of years, this process of descent with modification could transform a population into an entirely new species. This idea was the intellectual equivalent of a bomb. It directly challenged the biblical story of creation, a narrative that placed humanity as the special, central figure in a universe made by God. Darwin's theory suggested a different story, one where humans were simply another branch on the vast and tangled tree of life, connected by common ancestry to every other living thing from the whale to the worm. The immediate backlash was fierce and personal. Critics caricatured Darwin, depicting him as a monkey to mock the idea of a shared ancestry with apes. The scientific and religious establishments erupted in debate, with one famous confrontation at Oxford seeing Bishop Samuel Wilberforce condescendingly ask biologist Thomas Henry Huxley if it was through his grandfather or his grandmother that he claimed descent from a monkey. Huxley's brilliant retort was that he would not be ashamed to have an ape for a grandfather, but he would be ashamed to be connected to a man who used his great gifts to obscure the truth. Beyond the fiery rhetoric, the book's true power was its undeniable, meticulous evidence. Darwin had spent decades assembling observations from his voyage on the HMS Beagle, from pigeon breeding to the unique finches of the Galapagos Islands, each with beaks perfectly adapted to their specific food source. The theory made sense of the natural world in a way no other idea ever had. It explained why fossils of extinct creatures resembled modern ones, why embryos of different species look so similar in their earliest stages, and why seemingly useless vestigial structures like the tiny leg bones in a whale even existed. This single volume did not just add a new chapter to biology, it rewrote the entire book. It provided a unified, testable framework that turned biology from a descriptive catalogue of life into a predictive science. It forever altered our understanding of medicine, genetics, and ecology. But perhaps its most profound impact was philosophical, forcing humanity to look in the mirror and see not a fallen angel, but an ascended ape, a creature shaped by the same blind, beautiful, and impersonal forces that shaped every other living thing on the planet. A bitter wind whipped across the dunes of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, on the morning of December 17, 1903. Two brothers, Orville and Wilbur Wright, were preparing for their fourth attempt of the day with their fragile wooden and fabric flying machine. They flipped a coin to decide who would pilot the first powered flight, and Orville won. He lay flat on the lower wing, his hips nestled in a wooden cradle that controlled the wing warping for balance. At 10:35 in the morning, the engine sputtered to life. The machine rolled forward along a 60-foot wooden rail, Wilbur running alongside, steadying the wing. Then it lifted. For 12 seconds it flew unevenly, just 10 feet above the ground, covering a distance of 120 feet before landing safely in the sand. It was clumsy, it was brief, but it was the first time in human history a machine carrying a person had achieved sustained, controlled, powered flight. That single, wobbly journey of 12 seconds was the spark that ignited the age of aviation. Within a few short decades, that spark became a blaze that reshaped the entire planet. The world, once a vast and disconnected collection of continents, began to shrink. What used to be a perilous, months-long sea voyage across the Atlantic became a matter of hours. Global commerce was reborn as fresh fruit, mail, and critical supplies could be flown across oceans overnight. The very concept of distance was forever altered, making our planet feel like a single, interconnected community. But this new power also cast a long shadow. The airplane revolutionized warfare. introducing the terrifying specter of aerial bombardment that could reach far behind enemy lines, transforming battle from a frontline conflict into a total war that engulfed entire civilian populations. From that one cold, windy beach, humanity gained the ability to bridge continents and forge global culture, but also to deliver destruction on an unprecedented scale. The brothers took 3 more flights that day, the final one lasting nearly a full minute. A world that went to sleep that night thinking the sky was a limit, woke up the next morning to discover it was merely a new beginning. A single, confused announcement shattered a decades-long silence. On the evening of November 9, 1989, a weary East German official faced a press conference and was asked when new, relaxed travel regulations would take effect. He flubbed the answer, stating incorrectly that the changes were effective immediately. The news flashed across the airwaves and a wave of disbelief washed over East Berlin. Could it be true? Was the border really open? Cautiously at first, then in a swelling, unstoppable tide, people began to gather at the checkpoints, demanding to cross. The overwhelmed and leaderless border guards, with no clear orders to fire on such a massive, peaceful crowd, had no choice. They opened the gates. Euphoria erupted. East Berliners streamed through, embraced by West Berliners on the other side. They did not just walk through the gaps, they climbed onto the hated barrier itself, dancing, singing, and weeping with joy. They brought hammers and chisels, and with their own hands they began to tear the wall down, piece by symbolic piece. That concrete and barbed wire scar had been more than just a physical division. It was the stark, brutal symbol of the Iron Curtain, the front line of the Cold War. Its fall in a single, spontaneous night was not a military defeat, but a total ideological collapse. The will of the people had simply rendered it obsolete. Within a year, East and West Germany were formally reunified into a single nation. The Soviet Union's grip on Eastern Europe vanished, and the entire Warsaw Pact dissolved, redrawing the map of Europe and ending a global standoff that had threatened nuclear annihilation for nearly half a century. One misstated sentence at a press conference did not just open a border, it closed a chapter of world history, proving that no wall is ever strong enough to contain the human spirit. A glint of something yellow in the tail race of a sawmill changed a continent in an instant. It was January 24, 1848, and James W. Marshall, a carpenter building a mill for John Sutter in the California foothills, spotted a few tiny, gleaming flakes in the diverted water. He brought the metal to Sutter, and their quiet, secret testing confirmed it was gold. They tried to keep the discovery under wraps, but news of such a treasure is impossible to contain. A merchant named Sam Brannan saw his opportunity, striding through the streets of San Francisco holding a vial of gold dust aloft, shouting, "Gold, gold from the American River." With that single theatrical act, gold fever erupted. The entire world seemed to catch the sickness. Farmers abandoned their plows in the fields, sailors deserted their ships in the harbor, and shopkeepers locked their doors for good. They were called the 49ers, the hundreds of thousands of men who raced west by any means possible, cramming into creaking ships for the long voyage around Cape Horn or risking disease and starvation on the brutal overland trails. This was not a planned migration, it was a human stampede. The sleepy Mexican territory of California was utterly overwhelmed, its population exploding almost overnight. This single, accidental discovery achieved in months what decades of policy could not. It cemented American westward expansion as an unstoppable force. The influx of people created an urgent need for law, order, and government, rocketing California to statehood in just 2 years, bypassing the usual territorial phase entirely. The economic shockwaves were just as profound. The massive influx of gold supercharged the national economy, financing industrial growth and helping to build the railroads that would soon bind the continent together. But the rush also cast a dark shadow. devastating the local Native American populations through violence and disease, and intensifying the national debate over slavery as the question of whether new states would be free or slave suddenly took on monumental importance. One man's discovery in a millstream did not just unearth a precious metal, it forged the modern American West. The future of travel was supposed to be majestic and serene, a cruise through the clouds. On May 6, 1937, the German passenger airship LZ-129 Hindenburg floated gracefully towards its mooring mast in Lakehurst, New Jersey. It was concluding a transatlantic voyage, a symbol of luxury and cutting-edge engineering. On the ground, a radio reporter named Herb Morrison was there to describe the routine landing for his Chicago station, his voice calm and professional. Then, in an instant, everything changed. A flicker of flame appeared near the ship's tail. Morrison's broadcast turned from a routine report into a visceral, real-time tragedy. His voice cracked with horror as he narrated the unfolding catastrophe. Oh, the humanity! The entire hydrogen-filled airship was engulfed in a massive fireball in less than a minute, a terrifying spectacle of orange flame and black smoke against the evening sky. The colossal skeleton of the ship crumpled as it fell to the ground, a dying leviathan. The entire horrifying event, lasting just 34 seconds, was captured not only on Morrison's iconic audio recording but also on newsreel film. The world did not just read about the accident in the papers the next day. They saw it and heard it as if they were standing there on the field themselves. Of the 97 people on board, 36 perished, a tragic but comparatively small number given the scale of the disaster. The true death, however, was of an entire technology. The Hindenburg was not the first airship to crash, but it was the first disaster to be a mass media event. The vivid, terrifying images shattered the public's perception of safety. The idea of cruising comfortably in a giant bag of highly flammable hydrogen gas suddenly seemed not luxurious but ludicrously dangerous. Confidence in rigid airships evaporated overnight. Flights were cancelled, bookings vanished, and the German government immediately retired its entire fleet of passenger Zeppelins. This single, spectacular accident, burned into the public consciousness by film and radio, did more than claim one ship. It single-handedly ended the era of the passenger airship as a viable form of mass transit. The skies were now cleared for a different technology to claim the future of commercial flight. The airplane, once seen as noisy and unreliable, was now viewed as the safer, more practical alternative. The fiery demise of one giant airship in New Jersey cemented the destiny of aviation, ensuring that the future would be built with wings, not with gas bags. The Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles was a deliberate stage for humiliation. Its vast, gilded expanse and countless reflective surfaces were designed to magnify the glory of the French monarchy, and on June 28, 1919, that glory was turned like a weapon upon a defeated Germany. The victorious Allied powers gathered in this opulent room to present the terms of peace, a document so punitive it was less a treaty and more a forced confession. German delegates were led into the hall as virtual prisoners, surrounded by the very nations that had bled them dry for 4 years, and given a simple, brutal choice: sign or face a renewed invasion. They signed. The Treaty of Versailles was not merely a peace agreement, it was a cage built with legal clauses. Its most devastating component was Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause, which forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for causing the war and all the losses that resulted. This was not just a political statement, it was a legal justification for the crippling reparations that followed. Germany was ordered to pay the equivalent of 132 billion gold marks, a sum so astronomically large it was calculated to keep the German economy in chains for generations. The nation lost all of its overseas colonies and a tenth of its European territory, while its military was shrunk to a token police force. The intent was clear: to ensure Germany could never threaten its neighbors again. But this single document, crafted to end all wars, instead planted the seeds for the next, far more terrible conflict. The treaty did not bring peace to Germany. It brought a decade of economic despair and seething, festering resentment. The reparations strangled the Weimar Republic's fragile economy, leading to the hyperinflation of the 1920s, where wheelbarrows full of worthless banknotes were needed to buy a single loaf of bread. Middle-class savings were wiped out overnight, and ordinary citizens felt a deep, personal sense of betrayal and shame. This toxic environment became the perfect breeding ground for extremist voices, for demagogues who pointed at the Treaty of Versailles and screamed of a national stab in the back. One such voice, a former corporal named Adolf Hitler, would harness this collective fury with terrifying skill. He built his entire political movement on the promise of tearing up the treaty, of restoring national pride, and of seeking vengeance. The path to the Second World War was not an accident. It was paved, stone by stone, by the vengeful terms signed in that glittering hall. One peace treaty designed to end a war guaranteed another would begin. For 13 days in October 1962, the entire world held its breath. An American U-2 spy plane had taken photographs over Cuba, and the grainy images revealed a chilling truth: Soviet medium-range ballistic missile sites under construction, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. These were not defensive weapons. They were capable of delivering nuclear warheads to Washington, D.C. in a matter of minutes. The world was suddenly, terrifyingly on the brink. President John F. Kennedy announced a naval quarantine, a blockade of Cuba to prevent more Soviet ships from delivering military supplies. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev denounced the move as an act of aggression. Soviet ships steamed toward the quarantine line while American warships and submarines waited, their orders clear, to stop them by force if necessary. In the White House, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council debated their options, from a targeted air strike to a full-scale invasion, each choice carrying the near certainty of triggering a nuclear exchange. The two most powerful men on Earth were now locked in a game of chicken with the fate of humanity as the prize. The world watched paralyzed as the clock ticked down. Then, on October 27th, the crisis reached its absolute peak. An American U-2 plane was shot down over Cuba, its pilot killed. Another U-2 accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace over Siberia, nearly provoking a Soviet intercept. And in the Atlantic, American destroyers began dropping depth charges on a Soviet submarine that had gone silent. The submarine's crew was hot, exhausted, and cut off from Moscow. They had no idea if war had already begun. The captain, believing the charges to be a sign of hostilities, argued for launching a nuclear torpedo. It took the vote of one man, the flotilla commander who was aboard by chance, to veto the launch. The world came within a single officer's decision of nuclear war. In the end, it was a secret back-channel deal that pulled the world back from the edge. Kennedy publicly agreed to Khrushchev's offer to remove the missiles in exchange for a pledge not to invade Cuba, and he secretly promised to remove American Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The Soviet ships turned back, the missiles were crated and sent home. The immediate crisis was over, but the shock of how close they had come to annihilation lingered. This single confrontation forced a profound and permanent shift in superpower relations. Just 1 year later, the two nations established the famous Washington-Moscow hotline, a direct teletype link to prevent future misunderstandings from spiraling into catastrophe. It was the first tangible acknowledgement that in the nuclear age, communication was not just a tool of diplomacy, but a vital shield against extinction. The crisis also created the political will for the first major arms control agreements, starting with the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963. The 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis did not end the Cold War, but they forged a new, unspoken rulebook for managing it, a framework of cautious pragmatism that kept a fragile peace for the next 3 decades. A simple proposal for managing information would soon connect all of humanity. In 1989, a software engineer at the CERN particle physics lab in Switzerland named Tim Berners-Lee was frustrated. He saw brilliant scientists from all over the world struggling to share their research, with data and documents trapped on isolated computers, incompatible and difficult to find. He wrote a modest proposal for an information management system, a web of hypertext documents that could be viewed by anyone through a browser. His boss famously wrote on the cover, "Vague but exciting." That understatement would become one of history's greatest. Berners-Lee was not inventing the internet itself. The underlying network of connected computers already existed, largely for military and academic use. His genius was in building a simple, elegant layer on top of it, a system with three core inventions that made the network navigable for everyone. He created HTML, the simple coding language to create web pages, the URI, or web address, to give each page a unique location, and HTTP, the protocol that allows browsers to retrieve pages from servers anywhere in the world. The first website, which he launched in 1991, was naturally a page explaining what the World Wide Web actually was. It was a tool for physicists to share data, but its potential was limitless. The single decision to make the technology free and open with no patents or royalties was perhaps his most profound contribution. He gave it to the world. This act unlocked a global creative explosion. The web was not owned by any one company or government. It was a blank canvas for humanity. Within a few years, that canvas was filled with everything from online stores and newspapers to personal diaries and vast encyclopedias. It demolished the barriers of geography and cost, revolutionizing how we work, learn, shop, and connect. It created entirely new economies and reshaped old ones, gave a voice to the marginalized, and put the entirety of human knowledge just a few clicks away. Yet this same connectivity also brought new vulnerabilities, from the erosion of privacy to the rapid spread of misinformation. This single proposal, born from a physicist's desire to help his colleagues collaborate, did not just create a new technology. It built a new dimension of human existence, a digital realm that has fundamentally altered every aspect of our modern lives, proving that the most powerful tools are often those that simply connect us. The ground beneath San Francisco simply gave way at 5:12 in the morning. For less than a minute, a violent convulsion tore along the San Andreas Fault, shaking the city with a force that snapped water and gas mains like twigs. But the earthquake itself was only the beginning of the horror. The true cataclysm came from the fires, hundreds of them, sparked by overturned cook stoves and broken gas lines. With the water mains shattered, firefighters stood utterly helpless, watching as the separate blazes merged into a single, city-eating firestorm that raged uncontrollably for 3 days. When the last embers cooled, more than 3,000 people were dead, and a landscape of ash and rubble stretched for nearly 500 city blocks. The entire urban heart of the West Coast had been erased, yet from this total devastation came a radical rebirth. The old, hastily built wooden city was gone, and in its place rose a new San Francisco, constructed with a newfound respect for the unstable ground it stood upon. This single disaster became a brutal but essential teacher, forcing engineers to fundamentally rethink how to build in earthquake country. The study of seismology was born from the rubble, as scientists meticulously mapped the fault line and began to understand the mechanics of the Earth's violent shifts. Building codes were rewritten from scratch, mandating stricter standards for new construction, the birth of modern seismic engineering. And the chaotic, failed response to the fire led directly to the creation of organized, professional disaster preparedness protocols, the blueprint for how cities worldwide plan for the unthinkable. The death of one city taught the world how to build and prepare for a future where the ground itself could no longer be trusted. An emperor's desperate search for allies sent a single man on an impossible journey. The Han dynasty was under constant threat from nomadic tribes to the north, and Emperor Wu decided he must find a mythical people, the Yuezhi, rumored to hold a bitter grudge against these very nomads. He sent a court official named Zhang Qian west with 100 men, tasking him with forging a military alliance. The mission was a disaster. Zhang Qian was quickly captured by the very nomads he was meant to circumvent and spent 10 long years as a prisoner. Yet he never forgot his emperor's command. He eventually escaped and, with a steadfast loyalty that defies belief, did not turn back. He pressed on, finally finding the Yuezhi, only to discover they had settled in fertile new lands and had no interest in returning east to fight an old war. After 13 years, Zhang Qian began the long trek home, only to be captured once more. When he finally stumbled back into the Han court, he was accompanied by just a single one of his original 100 men. By the narrowest of definitions, his diplomatic mission was a total failure. He had secured no alliance, but he brought back something far more valuable: knowledge. He described to the emperor a world beyond their borders, of powerful empires and civilizations, of fast horses and strange crops, of vast wealth waiting to be traded. Emperor Wu, a visionary leader, saw the potential immediately. He sent Zhang Qian on further missions, not to find allies, but to formally open relations. This single, persistent act of exploration and diplomacy did not just establish a route, it wove a thread between two worlds. The Silk Road was born, a sprawling network of trade paths connecting the Han capital of Chang'an all the way to the Mediterranean shores of the Roman Empire. It was not one road, but many, a great artery of human connection. For the first time, Chinese silk, a marvel so light and fine Romans thought it was woven from clouds, could flow west to grace the shoulders of Roman aristocrats. In return, gold, glassware, and horses traveled east, but the caravans carried more than just luxury goods. They were a rolling exchange of human civilization itself. Technologies like papermaking and the stirrup moved west, changing the nature of communication and warfare. Religions like Buddhism traveled east from India, finding a new home and profoundly shaping Chinese culture. Diseases, too, traveled these routes with devastating consequences. The grapes for wine, the knowledge of astronomy, even artistic styles, all flowed back and forth along the path Zhang Qian had pioneered. One man's failed diplomatic mission became the central nervous system of the ancient world, binding east and west in a web of mutual influence that would shape the development of every empire it touched for centuries to come. The echo of the imperial coronation in Rome had faded into history, but on Christmas Day in the year 800, it was reborn in a stunning act of theater. Inside the magnificent St. Peter's Basilica, the king of the Franks, Charlemagne, knelt in prayer before the tomb of the apostle. As he rose, Pope Leo III stepped forward and placed a golden crown upon his head, proclaiming him Emperor of the Romans. The assembled crowd, carefully rehearsed, roared its acclamation. In that single, masterfully staged moment, the Pope had not merely crowned a king, he had resurrected an empire. The Western Roman Empire had been dead for over 3 centuries, its last emperor deposed. But the idea of Rome, with its legacy of universal law and order, never truly died. By bestowing this title upon Charlemagne, the Pope was doing more than rewarding a loyal protector who had defended him from rivals in Rome. He was making a profound political statement, declaring that the imperial authority of ancient Rome now resided not in Constantinople with the Byzantine Greeks, but in the West with a Germanic king and in alliance with the Church. This coronation forged an unbreakable link between the papacy and secular power, a partnership that would shape and haunt Europe for the next 1,000 years. The entity it created, which would later be called the Holy Roman Empire, became the central political framework of the Middle Ages. It established the precedent that the Pope had the authority to legitimize emperors, a power that would lead to epic clashes between future popes and kings over who held ultimate authority. This single ceremony on a Christmas morning set the stage for the investiture controversy, the power struggles of the Crusades, and the very political structure of a fractured Europe. It was a declaration that spiritual and temporal power were two sides of the same coin, a concept that would dictate the fate of nations and define the course of Western civilization right up to the dawn of the modern era. These 30 moments reveal a startling truth that our world is not built on grand designs, but on a foundation of beautiful, terrifying accidents. A single wrong turn, a forgotten petri dish, a misunderstood announcement, each one sent our collective story spinning down a path no one could have predicted. The chain of consequence is endless, linking the fall of a city wall to the discovery of a new world, and a king's messy divorce to the principles of modern liberty. Our present reality is the end product of all these cascading events, a tapestry woven from countless threads of chance. So we are left to wonder, what single event unfolding right now in our own time will future generations look back upon as the moment everything changed? What decision, discovery, or accident of our era will send history spiraling toward its next great chapter? Share your thoughts in the comments.